Guten Abend, mein Name ist Tim Müller, Mitarbeiter des Instituts, und ich darf Sie begrüßen heute Abend zu unserem Vortrag über Hitler und den Ersten Weltkrieg an diesem 14. Juli, den Tag, den man traditionell mit der Französischen Revolution verbindet. Und es regt dann doch dazu an, kurz darüber nachzudenken, dass das manchen historischen Denkern vielleicht sogar gefallen hätte, dass ausgerechnet über diesen Gegenstand an einem solchen Tag gesprochen wird. Ein ganzes Panorama kommt uns da vielleicht in den Sinn. Angefangen von manchen Warnern des 19. Jahrhunderts über die Entgrenzung der Utopie, den Zukunftswahn, die Ideologien, die blutig enden, die Gefahr monströser Entgleisungen, wenn man sich auf Abstraktionen verlässt. Die Reihe der Denker steht vor Augen. Im 20. Jahrhundert, nach 1945, verdichtet sie sich. Von Arendt, Camus, vielleicht auch Adorno, Horkheimer, Koselleck, Furet. Vielleicht hätte es auch Jan Philipp Reemtsma gefallen, dieser Gedanke, den er auch öfter vertreten hat. Und ihm lag auch daran, dass Brandon Sims hierher kommt, hier spricht, aber er selbst kann leider nicht dabei sein. Einer der frühen Skeptiker, der Revolutionskritiker, derjenigen, die nicht nur den Jakobinismus, sondern diese ganze auf Abstraktion basierte Politik für schädlich hielt, war bekanntlich Edmund Burke. Und jetzt wissen Sie vielleicht, warum ich diesen Bogen geschlagen habe. Der Ire, der die britische Politik so sehr prägte, den nur wer ihn nicht kennt oder die Forschung zu ihm nicht kennt, für einen simplen Vater des Konservatismus hält, diesen liberalen Politiker, Philosophen der Aufklärung, beschäftigte, wie man im Chaos der Moderne, ganz anders, kein Gegner der Moderne, wie man im Chaos der Moderne ein gewisses Maß an Ordnung stiften kann, das zivilisiertes Zusammenleben ermöglicht. Geschichte, tatsächliches Leben, Alltag und Eigensinn der Menschen in der Politik, nicht nur Prinzipien und Planungen. Das war vielleicht einer der politischen Leitgedanken bei Burke. Burke und Irland sind vielleicht gute Stichworte, um unseren heutigen Gast vorzustellen, Brandon Sims, der irische Historiker, der Professor für internationale Geschichte oder die Geschichte der internationalen Beziehungen an der Universität in Cambridge ist, Fellow des Peterhouse College, einem mythischen Ort der britischen Ideengeschichte, auf dessen Spuren Sie sich jedoch selbst begeben müssen. Und einer dieser vielen grandiosen und originellen Deutschlandhistoriker, die an britischen Universitäten immer wieder und immer noch zu finden sind. Die Bücher von Brandon Sims aufzuzählen, würde vielleicht zu lange dauern. Nur die thematischen Lichter, die thematischen Leitgedanken von einem frühen und wichtigen Buch über Napoleon und Preußen, von dem aus sich eine ganze Reihe von Studien zur deutschen Geschichte im 19. Jahrhundert ergeben haben. Auf einem anderen Terrain die scharfe, aber in eine sehr kluge Analyse verpackte Kritik der britischen Bosnienpolitik. Und da sieht man die Verbindungen zu Arbeiten über humanitäre Interventionen. Arbeiten zur britischen Geschichte, besonders des 18. Jahrhunderts. Und dann zuletzt die bekannten Werke zur Geschichte Europas von diesem 2013 auf Englisch zuerst erschienenen Werk Europe bis einem erst kürzlich und in diesen Debatten um den Brexit erschienenen Buch über Britain's Europe. Nicht alle, also was ein Leitfaden oder ein Leitmotiv in diesen Werken ist, könnte man sagen, vielleicht eine kluge, die wandelnden Bedingungen reflektierende Reformulierung des klassischen Primats der Außenpolitik. Vielleicht darf man das so sagen. Und wenn auch nicht alle Kollegen da nicken werden, ist es doch auffällig, wie sehr Brandon Sims, und das in Zeiten einer so lange andauernden sozial- und kulturgeschichtlichen Hegemonie, doch viele überzeugt hat, viel Begeisterung geweckt hat, vielleicht sogar Konvertiten im Fach hervorgerufen hat. Aber diese Begeisterungsstürme finden sich keineswegs nur innerhalb des Fachs der Geschichtswissenschaft, als diese deutsche Geschichte Europas von 1453 bis heute unter dem Titel Kampf um Vorherrschaft vor 2 Jahren auf Deutsch erschienen ist, überschlugen sich die großen Zeitungen in ihrem Lobpreis. Und nicht nur Gustav Seibt und Patrick Barners, sondern auch Wolfgang Schäuble oder Olaf Scholz haben sich als Fans bekannt. Dass der europäische Ire in England und Bewunderer, Verteidiger der angloamerikanischen Demokratie vor dem Brexit ein gefragter Mann in den britischen und internationalen Medien war, versteht sich von selbst. In dem Buch, das er dazu geschrieben hat, Britain's Europe, steht am Anfang als Motto ein interessantes Zitat, das ich doch erwähnen muss. 1871, wenige Tage nachdem in Versailles der deutsche Kaiser Wilhelm zum deutschen Kaiser ausgerufen war, erklärte Gladstone: Wir haben eine Geschichte, wir haben Tradition, wir haben lebendige, ständige, dauerhafte, vielfältige Beziehungen und Berührungen mit jedem Volk in Europa, so der britische Premierminister. Wir würden uns der Erinnerung an unsere Vergangenheit, unserer Hoffnung für die Zukunft, der Größe der Gegenwart unwürdig erweisen, wenn wir die Verpflichtungen verleugneten, die aus diesen Beziehungen zu anderen entstehen, die viel mehr dem Leid ausgesetzt sind als wir selbst. Dieses Zitat, wie viele Zitate in den Büchern von Sims, ist gut gewählt, weil es gleich so viel deutlich macht, wie er arbeitet, aber auch welche Thesen er vertritt. In diesem Buch wendet er sich übrigens auch, und das gehört eben dazu, das kommt in dem Zitat ja schon zum Ausdruck, nicht nur einerseits den Zufällen der Geografie und des Glücks zu, die diese britische Geschichte möglich gemacht haben, sondern schreibt, andererseits haben die Engländer und die Briten ihr eigenes Glück auch selbst geschmiedet. Sie haben 2 neue Formen der politischen Organisation hervorgebracht: den Nationalstaat, der durch das Parlament verkörpert wird, wie beschränkt auch immer, und das Konzept der multinationalen Union, die sich auf den Zusammenstoß von Parlamenten gründet. Und in einem schönen Bild erscheint die Europäische Union wie eine Art Verlängerung des Heiligen Römischen Reiches, dessen Zusammenbruch eine Katastrophe auch für Großbritannien wäre. Und weil er aber als Realist weiß, wie unterschiedlich die Traditionen sind, plädiert er für eine Konföderation zwischen einem europäischen Staat, einem multinationalen Zusammenschluss der Parlamente und dem im eng verbundenen Vereinigten Königreich. Aber schon in diesen ganzen europäischen Interventionen der Gegenwart ist ein anderes Leitmotiv, und das könnte man sagen, dass in Krisen Entscheidendes geformt wird, was dauerhaft Bestand haben könnte. In dem deutschen Vorwort der europäischen Geschichte heißt es dann auch wieder auf die Gegenwart bezogen: Was auch immer die Zukunft bereithalten mag, das große Opfer der letzten 5 Jahre ist die gradualistische Täuschung, Europa könne Stein auf Stein, Schritt für Schritt, peu à peu aufgebaut werden. Was wir stattdessen brauchen, ist ein kurzes, kollektives Feuer, in dem angesichts gewaltiger ökonomischer und außenpolitischer Gefahren neue Institutionen und letztlich neue Identitäten gebrannt werden. Aber es gibt nicht nur das Glück der Geografie und des Handelns, es kann auch Unglück geben. Und ein anderes Zitat von 1871 will ich Ihnen auch nicht vorenthalten, des amerikanischen Präsidenten Ulysses Grant, den Brandon Sims auch zitiert. Und man muss wissen, dass die USA da gerade diesen überaus blutigen nationalen Einigungskrieg hinter sich hatte, den Bürgerkrieg. Aber 1871 war seine Reaktion auf die Gründung des Deutschen Reiches, den Vergleich zu suchen zwischen Deutschland und Amerika. Volksnahe Institution eines freien Volkes sei er in Deutschland, den friedlichen Einfluss amerikanischer Ideen. Bismarck wurde in den Medien als deutscher Gründervater, als Washington des Deutschen Reiches gefeiert. Doch wie Sims ergänzt und ein wenig den Ton umschlagen lässt: Im Unterschied zu den Vereinigten Staaten lag dieser neue Koloss jedoch im Herzen Europas. Durch die Konsolidierung der Mitte Europas war der Puffer aus Zwischengliedern weggefallen, der die Großmächte bisher voneinander getrennt hatte. Und da ist es wieder diese Beachtung der Geografie, der Lage, der strategischen Konstellation, die politisches Handeln zwar gestalten kann, aber denen es auch niemals völlig entkommen kann. Das ist einer der Wege, wie Sims es immer wieder gelingt, zuvor für selbstverständlich Gehaltenes in Frage zu stellen, noch einmal zu überprüfen, intellektuell unzureichende Gewissheiten vielleicht zu zertrümmern. Aber dabei bekennt er sich dazu, selbstkritisch, aber dezidiert selbst Stifter von historischen Zusammenhängen zu sein, Er bekennt sich zu einem Ansatz, der unnachgiebig whiggisch ist und sich dafür nicht rechtfertigt, sowohl was die Zentralität Europas betrifft, als auch die direkten Linien der Vergangenheit in die Gegenwart, die Sims in seinen großen Erzählungen zieht. Aber zugleich, und darum wird es heute Abend eher gehen, ist Sims auch der skrupulöse Historiker, der detailbesessene Forscher, der methodisch raffinierte Spurenleser, dessen Arbeiten zur deutschen und britischen Geschichte des 18. und 19. Jahrhunderts die Fachdiskussion geprägt haben. Und nun ist der Gegenstand seiner Forschung der vielleicht schrecklichste und zugleich bedeutendste, den sich ein Historiker aussuchen kann. Aber wer nach der Lektüre so vieler Hitler-Biografien vielleicht dazu neigt, den berühmten Satz von Karl Kraus abwandeln zu wollen, den Historikern fällt zu Hitler nichts Neues mehr ein, der wird von Sims eines Besseren belehrt. Diese Kombination aus gründlicher Forschung und eigenständigem Nachdenken erweist sich dabei wieder als überaus produktiv. Geschult und belesen in den besten, auch deutschen Traditionen der Geschichtswissenschaft, steht er dafür gleichzeitig für die Dignität historischer Erkenntnis in einem Zeitalter der Sozialwissenschaften. Sein erstes großes Werk zur deutschen Geschichte, The Impact of Napoleon, selbst ein Zitat in der britischen Ideengeschichte, über Preußen um 1800, endete mit einem Zitat von Friedrich Wilhelm III. Im September 1805. Mehr als ein König ist untergegangen, weil er den Krieg liebte. Ich werde untergehen, weil ich den Frieden liebte. Wir sind schon sehr gespannt darauf, wie der letzte Satz der Hitler-Biografie von Brenton Sims lauten wird. Aber weil wir darauf vielleicht noch ein wenig warten müssen, freuen wir uns jetzt auf den Vortrag, der auf Englisch gehalten wird. Aber die Fragen können wir hinterher gerne auf Deutsch stellen. So, Brenton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim, for those very kind words of introduction. I think you've exaggerated greatly, but I'm still thank you for it. And I'm particularly grateful for the invitation to come to Hamburg and the Institute for Sozialforschung, which of course is a legendary place in the study of contemporary history. So again, thank you very much. The First World War has often been described as the defining event of the 20th century. Its most famous graduate was surely Adolf Hitler. It is not surprising, therefore, that his biographers have particularly emphasized this period in the life of the later dictator. Joachim Fest speaks of, quote, salvation through the war, and, quote, the war as a formative experience. Ian Kershaw, probably his best-known biographer, living biographer, writes that, quote, the First World War made Hitler possible, not just by ultimately creating the constellation which brought the Nazis to power, but also by providing, especially in the last 2 years of the conflict, quote, a vital staging post in Hitler's ideological development. One of his most recent biographers, Volker Ulrich, entitles the relevant chapter, quote, the key experience of the war. Without the experience of the First World War and its consequences, he writes, Hitler would not have become that which he was to become. It made his whole career possible in the first place. Gerhard Hirschfeld, who studied some of Hitler's later speeches on the First World War, saw the conflict, quote, as an experience which shaped him personally in profound ways and was also educational. John Williams, the first to take a detailed look at Hitler's First War, speaks of, quote, a university of the trenches, which educated him politically and militarily. I quote again, it hardly exaggerates to say, Williams claims, that every military decision made by Hitler between 1939 and 1945 was in some way influenced or colored by his experiences with the List Regiment. Over the past decade, moreover, our understanding of Hitler in the First World War has been substantially enhanced. In his painstakingly researched account of Hitler's early political career, Anton Joachimsthaler showed that far from being shaped by his Viennese years before the war, or the experience of the war, Hitler was in fact a product of the revolutionary period in 1918-1919, which he witnessed at first hand in the Munich Republic. Thomas Weber, in his recent but already classic book on Hitler and the First World War, has put our understanding of Hitler's First War, as he calls it, on a completely new empirical and conceptual basis, superseding all previous accounts. Embedding his study in a deep understanding of the regional and cultural milieu of Hitler's regiment, Weber demolishes countless myths about his role during the conflict. Even more importantly, by showing that important elements of Hitler's ideology, especially his anti-Semitism, were entirely unformed by 1918, Weber makes clear that whatever made Hitler, it was not the war itself. Recently, Ottmar Plöckinger has subjected the immediate post-war years to intense scrutiny on the basis of new material. Now, this lecture builds on, but also attempts to go beyond, these groundbreaking works as part of an overall reinterpretation of Hitler's political career. So what I'm about to say arises, as Tim has said, out of work I'm doing for my new biography of Hitler. Its central argument, the central argument of the biography, is that his most important preoccupation from start to finish was not Bolshevism and the Soviet Union, but capitalism and Anglo-America. In this context, the First World War was a seminal moment for Hitler. The main result of the war was not, as often thought, his hatred for Jewish socialism and communism, important though these sentiments were for his worldview. Rather, the war should be seen as the crucible for an ideology which was primarily anti-capitalist, or at least anti-international capitalist, and thus anti-Semitic. The war also created a healthy fear of, and respect for, Anglo-American power, which stayed with Hitler for the rest of his life and shaped his entire later career. By stripping away much of what Hitler and others wrote about him, about his time in World War I, but also taking his own statements seriously in their proper context, we can arrive at a more rounded figure of this seminal period in the creation of history's most catastrophic figure. Now, it's worth pausing here to note how little reliable evidence we have for Hitler's conduct and thoughts before and during the First World War. Ever since Brigitte Hamann's pioneering account of Hitler's days in Vienna, historians have been much warier of his memoir Mein Kampf as a source of biographical details. And Brigitte Hamann, by the way, is one of the really good historians on Hitler. I've learned a lot from her work. They're also more cautious about the dating of his anti-Semitism, for which she showed there was no direct evidence before 1914. This meant that the moment by which Hitler had definitively developed his distinctive vision had to be pushed back by many years. Likewise, the detailed researches of Thomas Weber, as I've said, sometimes confirm Hitler's claims, but much more frequently show them to be misleading and at times downright mendacious. His many subsequent remarks on the First World War often provide vital clues to his thinking at the time they were made, but are an unreliable guide to his views or state of mind during the conflict itself. Moreover, much subsequent testimony by friends and enemies is so colored by political considerations or some other animus as to render it useless. One way or the other, historians must try to counter a teleological instinct to read back into the dictator's early years beliefs which are only documented for a later period. They must also avoid, as far as possible, argument by syllogism, in which Hitler's thinking is inferred rather than spelled out in his own words. Now, there's two ways of dealing with this problem. The first, which was adopted by Anton Joachimsthaler in Hitler's Weg, is to assemble all the available evidence and to publish it in chronological order. This results in a largely positivist narrative with some analytical and contextual elaboration. Valuable though this exercise has been, and Joachimsthaler has been a major contributor to our understanding of Hitler's early years, valuable though it is, the danger is that the development and shape of Hitler's ideas is rather lost in a mass of detail. The second approach, most pronounced in the work of Ottmar Plöckinger on the immediate post-war period, is to ground Hitler's story in a deep contextual study of contemporaries, intellectual currents and events. Now, this substantially advances our understanding of Hitler's milieu, but it runs the risk of submerging the subject somewhat. It is no criticism of that author per se, rather a mere statement of fact, to say that when the contextual amplification is stripped away, what can reliably be said about Hitler is actually very limited. So the danger here is to deduce from the views of contemporaries what the later Führer actually believed, in the absence of any corroborating evidence from the man himself. For this reason, a more, as I would call it, Hitler-centric approach to this period of his life and his biography in general may be required. So what I've done in this lecture, what I will do, is to take the somewhat radical step of relying for the war years only on contemporaneous evidence from Hitler, also on contemporaneous material about him, and on verifiable contextual information, both contemporaneous and later. And if you do that, the amount of actual evidence you have radically collapses. Here the record is thin for 1914 to 1915 and tails off almost entirely for the last 3 years of the war, for which hardly any letters from Hitler survive. That said, I have unearthed some important new evidence for the war itself, including material which sheds light on Hitler's early perception of the power of the United States. Moreover, Hitler's military service continued until 1920, which he regarded as the continuation of the struggle by other means. And for this period, more information is available, at least some more information. So this means that the bulk of the argument of this lecture will address the role of the First World War in the subsequent formation of Hitler's Weltanschauung, drawing not only on his immediate post-war utterances, but also for the first time systematically on the speeches he gave in the mid to late 1920s. These cast, as we shall see, crucial light on his thinking about the United States and the war, a hitherto completely neglected aspect of his thinking on the conflict. In general, what I'm assuming is that what is of world historical importance about Hitler and the First World War is not so much what he actually did, significant though that is, and we'll come to that, but how he later interpreted it. So what follows is intended both as a description of Hitler's key experiences during the war, most, but by no means all of them, familiar to you, I'm sure, from the secondary literature, and as a novel argument about their impact on the development of his political beliefs. Important aspects of his later thinking about the conflict, such as his relationship with his superior officers, his remarks on the horror but also the camaraderie of war, the need for allies, the blockade, the perils of a two-front war, have already been dealt with extensively by historians. So I'm going to leave them to one side in this lecture, but I'll be very happy to talk about them in the discussion. Instead, I'm going to concentrate on the most important lesson which Hitler drew from the war, which was a keen sense of the demographic and financial power of Anglo-America and its connection to Jewish international capitalism. So we move to Hitler's activities in the war itself. Oops. Hitler greeted the outbreak of war in 1914 with enthusiasm. A contemporary photograph taken by his later associate and propagandist Heinrich Hoffmann before they had met clearly shows Hitler, and it almost certainly is him, among the cheering crowd on the Odeonsplatz in Munich, singing the nationalist ballads Wacht am Rhein and the Deutschlandlied, which was then, of course, not yet the official national anthem, on the 2nd of August. He volunteered to fight in the Bavarian army and was recruited 2 weeks later into the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment, known as the List Regiment, after the name of its commander. The formation was not a volunteer regiment as such, but consisted of a cross-section of mainly South Bavarian society, some of whom had volunteered, such as Hitler, some of whom were conscripted. It spent the next few weeks training, mainly in Munich itself, but also at Lechfeld camp south of Augsburg. And then they were sent to support the rapid German advance through Belgium and northern France. Now, very little is certain about Hitler's political views before he left for the war. Given his cordial childhood personal relations in Linz with the family's Jewish doctor Eduard Bloch, whom Hitler respected, and with several Jews in Vienna, documented by Birgitta Hamann, and the absence of any other contemporary evidence, it is unlikely that he was, by this stage, particularly anti-Semitic. His claims in Mein Kampf that he was politically educated in Vienna therefore need to be treated with extreme caution. There is also no evidence, although it's not implausible, that Hitler was already an extreme nationalist. We do know, however, that Hitler already strongly disliked the multinational Habsburg Empire, not because he tells us in Mein Kampf, but rather because his move from Vienna to Munich was not only artistically motivated, but also driven by a desire to avoid conscription into the Austro-Hungarian army. When he was eventually forced to report for duty at Salzburg, he persuaded the authorities that he was unfit to serve. Now we know that Hitler's motivation here was not cowardice or convenience, because he did not react to the outbreak of war in Munich by disappearing. This would have been easy to do, as he did not feature on any local call-up records. Instead, Hitler immediately volunteered for the German, or rather technically, the Bavarian army, an unusual and problematic choice which caused the Bavarian authorities a minor bureaucratic headache. In 1914, Hitler definitively not just turned his back on Vienna, but opted decisively for Berlin. So this was his first major documented political statement. It's the first political thing we actually know about Hitler, I would say. But here's the next thing we know. The main enemy, Hitler believed, lay across the Channel. His very first surviving letter, after he joined up to his former landlady, Anna Popp in Munich, announces his hope that he would, quote, get to England, presumably as part of an invading force. Strikingly, Hitler did not target the Tsarist Empire in the East, even though it was at this point menacing East Prussia. Throughout the war, indeed, there was only one reference to the Eastern Front. Now, maybe there are lost letters, but it's very, very striking that he shows little interest in the war on the Eastern Front, and actually after the war, when we have lots of evidence, hardly mentions it at all either. So he's very much focused on the war in the West, like most Germans. Nor did he single out the French hereditary enemy. In focusing on Britain, Hitler may have been echoing the contemporary discourse of Englandhass in Germany generally, and in his unit in particular. Or he may even have been ahead of it. One way or the other, Hitler's expressed desire to get to grips with the British long before he reached the front, and at a time when the British Expeditionary Force only represented a small fraction of the Allied troops facing Germany in the West, referred to famously by the Kaiser as a contemptible little army, represents his second major political statement, and one which, I would argue, points to the future development of his worldview, which was based on the fear of British power. Now, not long after, the List Regiment duly encountered the British at Geluveld, and then at Wytschaete and Messines in Flanders. Now, the story of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 is traditionally seen as an unequal struggle with the German juggernaut. This is true enough in the broad sense, but it's important to remember that at the tactical level, the picture was much more differentiated. The List regiments clash with men from the Yorkshire Regiment, the 1st Coldstream Guards, 1st Black Watch, Grenadier Guards, and the 2nd Gordon Highlanders, was in fact a battle between amateurs and professionals. Some of the listers, among them Hitler himself, had no military background at all prior to the war. With the exception of some of the officers, none were regulars. The British Expeditionary Force, by contrast, were experienced soldiers, many of whom had seen action before, and most of whom were better and quicker shots than their German adversaries. Geluveld was thus a profoundly unequal battle. Now, in the circumstances, the List regiment acquitted itself well, but it suffered horrendous casualties. Hitler himself participated in several frontal attacks, 3, if his own account is to be believed. He spoke, quote, of the heaviest battles, but that eventually, quote, the English, as he called them, were beaten. The defeat inflicted on the British proved to be short-lived, however, as the Bavarians were ejected from Geluveld soon after by the Worcester Regiment. Hitler was promoted Gefreiter, and assigned as an orderly, a dispatch runner, to the regimental staff. Since then, he claimed, quote, I can say that I risked my life daily and looked death in the eye. Probably not an exaggeration for this period of his military service. On the 2nd of December, Hitler was rewarded for his service with the Iron Cross Second Class. It was, he wrote, quote, the happiest day of my life. He asked his landlord to keep the newspaper recording his decoration as a memento, quote, if the Lord our God lets me live. So his first encounters here are actually quite lethal ones with Britain. I think that really shapes his view for the future. Hitler served out the rest of the war as a regimental dispatch runner, rather than in the front line, strictly speaking. At times of intense military activity, however, this could be a distinction without much of a difference. For example, Hitler's next letter in mid-February 1915 described the impact of a shell on his position, from which he was, quote, rescued as by a miracle, but conceded, quote, that he was being made nervous by the constant artillery fire, all British artillery fire. He also welcomed the fact that Germany was, quote, at last mobilizing opinion against England, further evidence of his preoccupation with Britain. 8 days later, he wrote of another, quote, terrible cannonade and further battles with the British. Indeed, the List Regiment was forced on the defensive as more and more British troops arrived on the Western Front. Hitler's next major battle, in March 1915 at Neuve-Chapelle, was preceded by an even more massive British artillery bombardment. And by the way, these British artillery bombardments gain in intensity and sophistication as the war goes on. It's one thing the British are really good at by 1918. And this is, in many German memoirs, there's a profound psychological trauma faced with this form of industrial warfare. Anyway, it was preceded by a massive British artillery bombardment, and this was followed by the first encounter with imperial troops, men from the Indian Army. A month later, at Fromelles and Aubers Ridge, Hitler faced more units from the Empire, especially Canadians. In time, the variety of exotic headgear in the enemy trenches, quote, turbans, peaky-pointed hats and tropical helmets, this is actually not a Hitler quote from another person, gave the men of the List Regiment a depressing sense of the world arrayed in arms against them. Now, this impression was reinforced the following year. After a long, quiet spell in the regimental headquarters at Fourmes, during which he seemed to spend a lot of time painting, sketching, and reading, Hitler was back in action at Fromelles in May-June 1916. This time, the List Regiment was confronted with Australians and New Zealanders, many of them hardened veterans of the battles of Gallipoli against the Turks. The Bavarians were once again discouraged to find themselves grappling with men who had travelled from the far side of the world to fight them in Flanders. Worse still, as Hitler's comrade Adolf Meyer recalled, some of the Australians were of German descent, and I'll elaborate on the significance of this later on. One of his captives, quote, not only spoke excellent German, but bore my own name of Meyer into the bargain. Understandably, this is all a quotation, his father was a German who had immigrated to Australia as a child with his parents and later married an English woman there. So this sense that Germans have gone abroad and are coming back as enemy soldiers. What Hitler himself made at the time of his regiment's encounters with British imperial troops is not recorded. Not long after, the List Regiment was sucked into the later stages of the Battle of the Somme. Hitler was lucky enough not to be right in the front line, exposed to machine gun and small arms fire at all times, but he was close enough to the action, being well within the range of enemy guns. His dugout was soon hit by a British artillery round, injuring him in the left upper thigh. The wound was not life-threatening, but serious enough for him to be evacuated. Hitler was sent to the army hospital in Belitz, southwest of Berlin, to recuperate. Here he would have been confronted for the first time with the results of the Allied blockade. Subsequently, he was detailed to the replacement battalion of the List Regiment in Munich. There he fretted about his inability to rejoin his unit. I quote, "A transport left a few days ago for the regiment, he wrote to his fellow dispatch runner, Balthasar Brandmeier, in late December 1916. But unfortunately, I can't join it. They're only taking old babblers. In January 1917, Hitler wrote to the adjutant of the List Regiment, Fritz Wiedemann, that, quote, I am combat ready once again, and expressed, quote, his urgent wish to return to his old regiment and old comrades. Max Unold, who served with him in the replacement battalion headquarters in the Luisenschule in Munich in early 1917, later confirmed that Hitler, quote, reported back for duty in the field. Now, Unold, interestingly enough, was unusual company for Hitler, in that he was an expressionist painter and a founder of the Münchner Neue Sezession. In March 1917, Hitler was back with his unit in regimental headquarters. Shortly after, the listers witnessed, although they were not directly involved in, the stupendous Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge. Before long, however, they were faced by ferocious British attacks during the Battle of Arras. Then, in the late summer of 1917, the List Regiment was back around Heluvelt in the Third Battle of Ypres, during which it was brutally hammered by British artillery for more than a week. I come back to this. It's constantly he's fighting the British. A combination of high explosive, shrapnel, and gas caused fearful casualties. Hitler was directly caught up in the fighting, as the regimental headquarters was in the line of the British advance in the Ypres salient. What he made of these experiences at the time is not known, unfortunately, as no contemporary records survive. When the shattered List Regiment was finally pulled out of the line, it was dispatched to Alsace, near Mulhouse, to recuperate. It was there, after nearly 3 years of primarily battling British, Indian, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops, that Hitler first faced a mainly French foe, facing them in anger. But this was a relatively uneventful posting. He doesn't actually do much fighting against the French. And then the List Regiment is moved again. It's deployed in support of the great German spring offensive of 1918. Moving up behind the assault troops, they encountered French colonial troops, the Algerian Zouaves, in late March. Again, the encounter with enemy colonial forces helps to inform his later attitude towards French colonial troops of color. Then, in mid-July 1918, the List Regiment ran into their first Americans at the Second Battle of the Marne near Reims. They were forced to beat a hasty retreat, but not before taking some prisoners. 2 of them, in a trip of which historians have hitherto been unaware, were dropped off by Hitler at brigade headquarters. And here's just, this hadn't been seen by any historian before I discovered it, not even Tom Weber. And it's just a very short document by the brigade adjutant, Fritz Wiedemann, says, durch gefreite Hitler wurden heute 2 amerikanische Gefangene vom Regiment 16 gefangen genommen, beim Brigadehauptquartier abgeliefert. Right? So when he later speaks, this is my crucial point, when he later speaks about his encounter with American soldiers in the First World War and the deep impression it made upon him, that is not fantasy. He did actually encounter these 2 American prisoners. I don't know who they are. I'd love to know, because it would be relevant. But they left a deep impression on him, to which we shall return. That's in the Bayerisches Kriegsarchiv. A deep impression on him, to which we shall return later. The men of the List Regiment were certainly under no doubt about the qualities of the Americans, and indeed Germany's other adversaries. A report of the 2nd Battalion of the List Regiment on the Second Battle of the Marne, written a month later, noted that, quote, the enemy, French, British, American, showed themselves tough in defense and brave in attack. By now, the Allied blockade, their control of the skies, and numerical superiority was beginning to wear down Hitler's regiment. Here I quote from the commander of the 3rd Battalion of the Reserve Regiment 16. I quote, the health and morale of the men suffers from the continuing lack of provisions. Similar sentiments were recorded in the other battalions. The war diary of the 2nd Battalion lamented, quote, the pressure from the far superior enemy who constantly deploys new troops, in brackets, Englander. All this was of a piece with the general picture along the line, which was of the offensive running out of steam in the face of crushing Allied superiority in men, materiel, and sheer energy. General Ludendorff famously spoke of these times as, quote, the Black Day of the German army. Again, we do not know what Hitler made of these developments at the time, but they can hardly have escaped his attention. The only established fact is that he was once again decorated in early August 1918, this time with the Iron Cross First Class. It was awarded on the recommendation of his Jewish commanding officer, Captain Hugo Gutmann from Nuremberg, even if he was not the man who actually pinned the decoration on Hitler's chest. At this moment, at the height of the Allied counteroffensive, Hitler was sent for a week's training to Nuremberg in signaling, followed by a fortnight home leave in September in Spital, Austria. While he was away, the Allies advanced relentlessly. The listers faced a variety of enemies, sometimes the French, but more usually the British. As in many German formations, morale plummeted under the weight of heavy Allied artillery bombardment and air attack. One report bewailed, quote, that enemy aircraft completely controlled the skies. Another noted with alarm that, quote, the desire for rest increases among the officers and men after each engagement. Only at least 4 weeks of quiet in good quarters with proper nourishment could revitalize the physically and morally exhausted fighters. The unit is currently at best suited for static warfare on a quiet sector of the front. End of quotation. By the end of the month, there was no holding the British. Quote, everybody has bolted. One company commander lamented, we are hanging in the air. He could not even send back men to fetch ammunition for fear that they would not return. By early October 1918, the gloom in the unit had deepened. Fridolin Soleder, an officer with the List Regiment, remembers, quote, an unequal struggle. Quote, one man always fights against 3 or 4. For how long? He lamented, quote, that since October 1918, more than 1.5 million fresh and aggressive Americans are in action on the other side of the lines. Africa, Australia, India, and Canada still send their youthful cohorts to Europe. Munitions, material, opinions, and masses of men face the German frontline soldier. The size of his struggle becomes hopeless. End of quotation. The prevailing sense of being at war with the whole world, of being outnumbered, outgunned, and, quote, out-opinioned, could not have been more clearly expressed. After more than 4 years of war, the List Regiment, like most of the German army, had had enough. Now, the returning Hitler was pitched into this crisis. In mid-October, he was injured in a gas attack by a British shell. Hitler was first treated in the nearby Bavarian field casualty station at Oudenarde, site of the Duke of Marlborough's famous victory over the French more than 200 years earlier. A week later, he was sent to convalesce in the Prussian Reserve Hospital at Pasewalk, near Berlin. There, Hitler heard of the conclusion of the armistice and the German surrender on the 11th of November, 1918. Most of the German army kept fighting to the last and only stopped when ordered to do so. But of the fact that it had been morally and militarily beaten in open battle, there could be no doubt. Whatever Hitler later said about the stab in the back, the Dolchstoß, a phrase, by the way, I think he only used once, as far as I can make out, there was no doubt in his mind and in his rhetoric that the Reich had ultimately succumbed to a superior coalition. So thus ended Hitler's slightly more than 4 years of war. His record was in some senses unusual. After an intense spell in the front line at the beginning, he spent the rest of the war at regimental headquarters, some distance behind. This was unquestionably a safer posting than that of an ordinary infantryman or even of a battalion or company runner. It was certainly more comfortable, giving him some time for reading and drawing. So far as we know, he mainly consulted books on architectural rather than political subjects. Some listers later claimed to regard him with suspicion on that account, and it is likely that Hitler's chances of being decorated were higher than average due to the fact that he was a familiar face among the officers making and deciding upon the recommendations. It may be, as some have suggested, that Hitler refused promotion in order to remain with the regimental staff. There is no doubt, in any case, that Hitler exaggerated and embellished his account of the war, and was careful to conceal the fact that he was not actually in the front line for most of the conflict. That said, Hitler's record is less distinctive than it might seem. It was not uncommon for private soldiers to refuse commissions in order to remain with their friends. Moreover, though Hitler by all accounts completed his missions efficiently, he showed none of the initiative expected of a potential officer. It is also worth stressing that Hitler saw combat, death, and destruction on numerous occasions. He was, as we've heard, he was seriously injured twice, not by accidents, but by enemy fire. The regimental headquarters was not really a rear area in any meaningful sense, being well within the range of enemy artillery. In short, there can be no doubt, even if later embellishments are stripped away, that Hitler was a courageous and effective, if somewhat limited, soldier during the First War. But when we come to politics, we have to note that Hitler's claim that the news of the armistice in November 1918 prompted him to become a politician needs to be taken with a large grain of salt. There is no contemporary evidence for it. That said, his political formation was not wide open. His hostility to the Habsburg Empire and his allegiance to Germany was by now well established. He was conscious of the importance of propaganda and the need to mobilize opinion, scharf machen, against the British. He saw the war as a struggle not merely against the external enemy, but also, quote, the inner internationalism of German society, by which he might have meant socialist, clericalist, particularist, or capitalist tendencies, or a combination of all three. Above all, is my key point here, Hitler had come away from the war with a keen sense of the power of the Entente, especially the British, in his eyes the most formidable of the world of enemies against which he had battled in vain those 4 years. But the main contours of his political thinking were not yet visible. There was as yet no engagement with the major forces of the age, Anglo-American plutocratic democracy, as he saw it, later, and Soviet Bolshevism. More importantly, despite his later assertions in Mein Kampf and elsewhere, there was no sign whatever of anti-Semitism. And in fact, I found evidence that even in the Third Reich, he actually gave special treatment via his adjutant, Fritz Wiedemann, to Jews who had served with him in the List Regiment. So it seems most unlikely that during his time in the List Regiment, he had felt a particular animus against Jews. Now, after the war ended, Hitler was discharged from hospital and assigned to a replacement battalion of the Bavarian infantry. And what's really important here, again, is what Hitler doesn't do. He doesn't join either a Freikorps or one of the border guard formations, the Grenzschutz, battling Germany's neighbours to the east, which were the usual havens for those of a robustly national disposition. He also made no attempt to resist the radical left-wing council government. Indeed, he was elected to the Soldiers' Council of his unit, and in some ways was also a servant of left-wing regimes in Munich. But important for our purposes are two events. First, Hitler is elected to represent a section of the army devoted to propaganda. And the second development is the news of the final humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles in late June 1919. Their general outlines have been known since May. Oddly enough, while the role of Versailles in Hitler's rise generally has been well recognized, its immediate impact has passed almost unremarked upon, although very recently Thomas Weber in Wie Hitler zu Hitler wurde has also discussed this. The treaty was crucial, however, for until that point, the dire territorial and financial consequences of the war were not yet apparent. Moreover, Even after the terms became known, many believed them so onerous that the Reich government would resume the war rather than submit to them. It was on this basis, rather than out of pique, that the commander of the fleet interned at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, for example, decided to scuttle his fleet rather than let it be used to coerce Germany. The National Assembly only accepted the treaty after a furious debate in July 1919. This was the immediate context to Hitler's first systematic, documented political and strategic reflections. How his thinking would have evolved if the terms had been less harsh, or if the German government had rejected them, or if he would then have even become politically active at all, is not knowable, but an interesting counterfactual. On the 20th of August 1919, Hitler made his first contribution to a debate in the Reichswehr Aufklärungskommando. 3 days later, he delivered a whole speech on peace terms and reconstruction. This is the first known major political statement by Hitler. The text, unfortunately, has not survived, although its likely gist can be derived from remarks made not long after, and we'll come back to that. A day later, Hitler is recorded as speaking on the issue of, quote, emigration, Auswanderung. And again, I will speak about the significance of that in a minute, which has completely eluded previous biographers of Hitler. 2 days later, a Reichswehr report describes him as having given, quote, a very good, clear and spirited lecture on capitalism, during which he touched, indeed had to touch, on the Jewish question. So it's talking about capitalism, no mention of Bolshevism yet, and the link is between capitalism and anti-Semitism. This was Hitler's first recorded reference to the Jews, and it was made very clearly in the context of capitalism, rather than Bolshevism or the German Revolution. That this was no coincidence becomes clear when we look at his next recorded statement, which is the famous letter to Adolf Gemlich, known to many or most, 3 weeks later, on the 16th of September 1919. Now, the Gemlich letter is the first surviving longer political text by Hitler, and it's been picked over by generations of historians, but they have almost invariably focused on Hitler's definition of the Jewish problem as a racial issue, rather than as a question of mere distaste. They've also emphasized his belief that the Jews had been the driving forces of the revolution, which had laid Germany low. What has been almost entirely missed is the fact that Hitler's initial anti-Semitism was profoundly anti-capitalistic, rather than anti-communist in origin. He speaks of the, quote, dance around the golden calf, the privileging of, quote, money, quote, the majesty of money, quote, the power of money, and so on. It's all about capitalism. What is more, he emphasizes the transnational affinity between German Jews and those of Poland and the United States. Here it is quite clearly the Jews of the US financial world in Wall Street that he has in mind. Of communism, Bolshevism, and the Soviet Union, 2 years after the Russian Revolution, not a word, as yet. Hitler, in other words, became an enemy of the Jews before he avowedly became an enemy of Russian Bolshevism. Then, from mid-November 1919, Hitler mounted a series of full-scale attacks in public speeches on the main enemy. Quote, the absolute enemies, and the absolute enemies are England, quote, England and America. Absoluten Gegner, England und Amerika. He relentlessly hammered the Entente, and although he mentioned the French leader Georges Clemenceau by name, the main thrust of his obloquy was directed towards the Anglo-Saxon powers. It was they who were determined to prevent Germany's rise to world power, in order not to jeopardize their, quote, world monopoly. Quote, that was also the reason, Hitler claimed, to make war on us, and now America, as a money country, it had to intervene in the war in order not to lose the money they had lent. These were loans from the Americans to the British and the French, particularly the British. Here he explicitly makes the link between his anti-capitalist critique and the hostile behavior of the Entente. This was often connected to Hitler's anti-Semitism. I quote again, the Americans put business before everything else. Money is money even if it is soaked in blood. The wallet is the holiest thing for the Jew. he claimed, adding, quote, "America would have struck with or without U-boats." So what's remarkable here is that the terms the Americans and the Jews are in this context used almost interchangeably. If Hitler's profound hostility to the Anglo-Saxon powers was shaped by his anti-Semitism, it was also distinct and, crucially, anterior to it. He had, after all, spent, as we've seen, almost the entire war fighting the English, as he called them, and latterly the United States. In short, Hitler became an enemy of the British, and probably also of their American cognates, before he became an enemy of the Jews. Indeed, he became an enemy of the Jews because of his hostility to the Anglo-American Jewish powers, capitalist powers. I quote here from early January 1920, one of his earliest remarks, quote, "We struggle against the Jew because he prevents the struggle against capitalism." The rest of Germany's adversaries, Hitler specified, fell into a second, milder category. The Russians and the French, so the argument ran, had become hostile, quote, "as a result of their unfortunate situation or some other circumstance." Hitler was by no means blind, of course, to the extent of French antagonism, but it is striking that he discoursed at much greater length about the financial terms of the treaty and the blockade than the territorial losses to Germany's immediate neighbours. This focus on Anglo-American, and especially on US strength, with or without anti-Semitism, was by no means unusual in Germany or even Europe generally. As Adam Tooze's new book, The Deluge, has shown, it reflected a much broader post-war preoccupation with the immense global power of the United States. Hitler's entire thinking and the policies of the Third Reich after 1933 was, in essence, a reaction to it. Now, Hitler put the inquest into the defeat at the heart of his Weltanschauung. The alleged fractures in German society played an important role here. The, quote, "inner internationalism," to which he had adverted during the war itself. By this, Hitler primarily meant the Social Democrats and Independent Socialists, who put their loyalty to their class, comrades, over that of the nation, according to Hitler. It was their internationalism, not their socialism, that he objected to. It was the same anxiety as over capitalism, which Hitler rejected in its global, but not necessarily in its local, national form. He also took aim at German particularism, especially in Bavaria, which threatened the integrity of the Reich. This aspect to Hitler's thinking has been unjustly neglected by his biographers. The principal internal enemy, however, were of course the Jews, who, quote, had stabbed Germany in the back, although Hitler, as I've said, only used this phrase once. All this has given the impression, though, that Hitler, like so many other Germans, sought to blame the defeat primarily on internal scapegoats rather than facing up to the strength of his enemies. In fact, Hitler never subscribed to a monocausal domestic explanation for the disaster, and much of his thinking, especially the quest for Lebensraum, would be inexplicable if he had. The main reason for the German defeat, in Hitler's eyes, was simple and compelling. It's the story we've heard. He elaborated it at length in the course of the 1920s. The enemy was just too strong. Picking up a note he had already sounded during the war, Hitler argued that Germany had been trying to mount, quote, resistance against the whole world, Widerstand gegen die gesamte Welt. 26 states, by his reckoning. Right from the start, she had faced the full might of the British, the French, and the Tsarist empires, though it was the former that Hitler really feared. The war was lost, he argued, not just because the core of the state was rotten, which is the domestic interpretation, but also, quote, because of the toughness of the British, Zähigkeit der Engländer, a clear rejection, again, of the monocausal domestic explanation for defeat. Indeed, Hitler returned to the power of the British repeatedly during the next 20 years or so. Moreover, in 1917, he argued in a later newspaper article, quote, the American Union was determined to throw its own weight into the scales in support of the world coalition threatening Germany. This was the decisive moment which made German defeat inevitable, and Hitler never forgot it. His whole subsequent strategy was designed to avoid American belligerency until he or his successors were ready. Hitler was well aware of the industrial strength of the British Empire and the United States. But in his view, the struggle against the Anglo-Americans during the First World War was not decided primarily by material factors. His vision of international politics was essentially human-centered. On Hitler's reading, the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been an epic demographic contest which the German Empire had spectacularly lost. She had failed to provide an outlet for her excess population either through economic or through territorial expansion, with the result that millions of Germans emigrated, most of them, of course, through this city. Meanwhile, our enemies built up huge empires which they could parlay into strength on the European battlefield. Hitler lamented, I quote, that the Entente had sent alien auxiliary peoples to bleed to death on European battlefields. And of course, he'd had personal experience of that, facing British Indian troops and French Algerian Zouaves. So when he's talking about the threat of French colonial troops in the early 1920s, which is often interpreted, and in part rightly so, as a racial issue, it's also a very huge strategic question for him. But the main threat, and this has not really been spotted by anybody, the main threat posed by the European empires was not the deployment of troops from what were then called the subject races, but from the white settler colonies. Some of the most formidable British troops on the Western Front had come from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They were numerous, well-fed, fit, often extremely violent, and highly motivated. Worse still was the fact that the Germans, which the Reich had exported in the 19th century for want of land to feed them, had come back to fight against her as American soldiers during the war. In later speeches, Hitler repeatedly came back to the moment, and this is talking now in the 1920s, this is the moment that I showed you in this document. The moment, quote, "In the midsummer of 1918, he writes, when the first American soldiers appeared on the battlefields of France, well-grown men, men of our own blood, whom we had deported for centuries, who are now ready to grind the motherland itself into the mud." I quote again, "These lads, blonde and blue-eyed, who are they really? They are all former German farmers' sons. Now they are our enemies." Moreover, the Germans who had left were always the, quote, "the best, the most dynamic elements in German society." Another quote, "That all added up and gave a new continent a particular high-value character. We encountered it in 1918 on the Western Front." In short, the racial struggle which Germany had just lost and which she desperately needed to avoid or to win the next time round was not that between German and Slav or German and Jew, but between Germans and an Anglo-America enriched by the most racially valuable elements of German society. Thus his view. These statements all stem from the 1920s, but there is no doubt that Hitler had been thinking in these terms ever since Versailles. The emigration question, Auswanderung, was of course the subject of his second major speech in September 1919. And it also underlay his next disquisition, which was on the internal colonization, the Ansiedlungsfrage. His thoughts on that subject so impressed his sponsor, Captain Meyer, that he announced his intention, quote, "to launch this official report abridged or in full in the press in a suitable manner." Moreover, although contemporary concern with the emigration went well beyond Hitler, it does not seem to have enjoyed a particular salience in the broader inquest into the war. At least I stand open to correction on this. It thus represents his distinctive contribution to the debate on German revival and the most important lesson he drew from the war. Henceforth, the emigration question and the associated American problem lay at the heart of Hitler's thinking. Strikingly absent from Hitler's thinking immediately following the war, and indeed thereafter, is any serious anxiety about Russian power or the Soviet Union. This is not surprising, given that Hitler's main enemy had been the Western Allies, and the fact that Russia had been defeated by 1917. But Hitler was not even worried about communism as an external threat. The impact of the Baltic émigré and ferocious anti-Bolshevik Alfred Rosenberg during this period was not significant, and in any case, the two men did not even meet until a few months later. Hitler saw Bolshevism as a disease which had knocked Russia out of the war and then undermined German resistance a year later. At no point at this time did he fear a Soviet invasion, not even after the victory of the Reds in the Civil War. Instead, and this is the crucial point, Hitler fretted that communism would destroy the last vestiges of German sovereignty in the face of the Entente. I quote, "The threatened Bolshevik flood is not so much to be feared as a result of Bolshevik victories on the battlefield, as rather as a result of a planned subversion of our own people, which would then deliver them up, quote, to international high finance." So Bolshevism as an instrument of international finance. Significantly, Hitler wasted no words on the Soviet Union in his early statements from 1919, save to predict that it was set to become, quote, a colony of the Entente. This means that capitalism and communism were not simply two equal sides of the anti-Semitic coin for Hitler. Bolshevism was clearly subordinate. Its function in the Anglo-American plutocratic system was to undermine the national economies of independent states and make them ripe for takeover by the forces of international capitalism. So I'm about to wind up. By the start of the 1920s, Hitler had largely completed his diagnosis of Germany's ills. He then spent the next 20 years elaborating his cure. The only way of standing up to the Anglo-Americans, Hitler argued, was a radical reformation at home and abroad. Its outlines are well known: a rigorous campaign against Jews and internationalist elements at home, and a strategy of massive territorial expansion abroad. This was designed to secure living space in the East, Lebensraum, and thus an outlet for the excess German population which would otherwise emigrate to the United States or some other part of the globe dominated by the Anglo-Americans. This space was to be secured in Russia because it was nearby, rather than in remote overseas colonies, and because Bolshevism had so hollowed the state there as to render it incapable of resistance. So he's not attacking the Soviet Union because it's Bolshevik in that sense. He's attacking it because he thinks it's going to be weak. The first part of this program was set out in Book 1 of Mein Kampf, the second in Book 2 thereof, and particularly in his subsequent unpublished second book, in which the United States completely takes center stage. The former is much better known than the latter, but the two need to be read together in order to make sense of them. Together with Hitler's long disregarded shorter writings and speeches from the 1920s, they clearly show, I don't have time to elaborate on this today, the extent of his preoccupation with Anglo-American power and its connection with the emigration question. The two key insights, and they're linked, which he derived from reflecting on the First World War. This fear coexisted with a profound admiration for the Anglo-Americans. The two emotions fed off each other. Later, Hitler hoped to secure a British alliance, sometimes to facilitate an attack on the Soviet Union and sometimes to balance against the United States. But this was a medium-term objective, designed to secure the acquiescence of London and Washington to the annexation of lands in the East with which he could then challenge, or at least contain, the two imperial capitals. He eventually gave up on this idea and resigned himself to British hostility. During the Second World War, he affected to despise Roosevelt's America, but this was mere whistling in the wind. His fear of the Anglo-Americans not merely exceeded Hitler's worry about communism in the Soviet Union, it completely structured his Eastern policy. Concern with emigration and the quest for Lebensraum, as we've seen, were closely linked, but it was the former which drove the latter. Indeed, despite his periodic and largely synthetic concerns about Bolshevism in the Soviet Union, the Anglo-American plutocracies and Jewish international finance, rather, remained his principal preoccupation to the very end in the bunker in April 1945. His last will and testament, 1945, made no mention of either communism or the Soviet Union, who were very close to his bunker, except obliquely when he spoke of the besiegers of Berlin, quote, as blind automata. But instead, he inveighs in his testament, quote, against the real villains, quote, international Jewry, the ruling political clique in England, the international conspiracy of money and finance, and also the Anglo-American bombers who had burned to death, quote, hundreds of thousands of men and women and children, many of them, of course, in Hamburg. So as at the beginning, so at the end. So in March 1920, Hitler took off his army uniform for good. By then, the main outlines of his worldview, expressed consistently in private correspondence, public meetings, and newspaper articles alike, were clearly visible. Fear of the Western Allies, especially Britain, a profound demographic anxiety about the United States, a violent hostility to international capitalism, a sense of the subversive effects of socialism and communism, and, of course, a coruscating anti-Semitism. None of these sentiments were visible before 1914. Fear of Britain and the world of enemies was first expressed at the start of the conflict. The rest were a response not to defeat as such, or even to the revolution, but to the consequences of defeat. It was the Versailles settlement which brought home the meaning of November 18. This was, after all, the subject of his first known speech, and its consequences, as we have seen, dominated his later thinking. Unlike most nationalists, territorial losses were the least of Hitler's concerns. As we have seen, he was far more worried about the long-term impact of perpetual debt bondage, the continued blockade, and a resulting surge in emigration by the best elements of German society. The conclusion is inescapable. It was not the war that made Hitler or even the revolution, but the peace. Thank you for your attention.